Moshe, do we use the...
No, you don't.
Just straight to YouTube?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, everyone say good morning, good morning. Let us begin. I'm going to begin by thanking our sponsors for today's shir, to thank our Talmud Torah sponsor for Adar Beis, Leah Sol, for dedicating the shirim and drushos this month in honor of all of those who planned the beautiful groundbreaking. I also want to take the opportunity to thank Rabbi Kalman Akiva for giving shir over the last 2 days. Always a great zuchos for us for the entire shir. And also with that, let us begin. Sorry, let me just... Good. But we have an incredible Gemara, really incredible Gemara ahead of us today, really exceptional Gemara ahead of us today. Hopefully you did your homework. We are beginning today, Chaf Amud Aleph at the Mishnah. So also we have a fascinating Mishnah today. Here we go. Klal Amr Yevamos. But what's actually interesting about this Mishnah now is that in Meretz Hashem we're going to go back and kind of get a little bit into some of the mechanics of Yibum. So the Mishnah says as follows: Klal Amr Yevamos. They said a klal, a general rule, when it comes to the Yevama, when it comes to Yibum, Kol Shi Isser Erva. So both say the truth is this is nothing new. We've been operating with this principle since the beginning of the Masechta. Any time that the Yevama is an Isser Erva. Both remember again, this is how we got started. How do we get started? Reuven and Shimon, right? Reuven is married to two women, Rachel and Leah. Rachel was Shimon's daughter. That's how we got started with this. And the principle was that Allah Lamaisa, a woman who is an Erva, is not shaykh to Yibum, right? It's not the pshat that she's petura, that she's exempt from Yibum. She is fundamentally outside of the framework of Yibum. So that's the Mishnah saying, Klal Amru, Klal Amru Yevama, Kol Shi Isra Erva, Lo Chol Letzes V'lo Mis Yevemes. A woman who is an Erva to the Yavam, a woman who is an erva to the surviving brother, does not do chalitza, nor does she do yibum, which Rabbi means she is not subject to the halachos of yibum at all. Isser mitzvah. So we'll say now we're going to get into some more categories. Really fascinating. Isser mitzvah, the Isser Kedusha. If Lamaisa, again, a woman is subject to an Isser mitzvah, we'll define what that means in just a moment, or Isser Kedusha, these are women who are also prohibited. These are cases of the Yevama where she is prohibited. We'll discuss the exact nature of the prohibition. The Isser mitzvah, Isser Kedusha, cholatzes v'lo misyavemes. Ultimately, again, these women do chalitza and they don't do yibum. Okay, we'll see what that means in just a moment. Next case, achosa shehi yevimta choletzes od misyavemes. So I will say this is the case of a sister who is also the Yevama, ultimately does chalitza or yibum. Now I will say if you take a look at the sheet I gave you, and I sent it out on the WhatsApp chat also, it might be easier to follow it along in a hard copy if you'd like. So I'll say, so just take a look. I'll tell you, this is the sefer. I bought the sefer the last cycle. Sometimes I find the pictures make it look more complicated than not, but Lamaisa, you'll see it's actually a very straightforward case. If you take a look at the first line, 119.1, see that first line? So you have two families over here. Two independent families, right? We'll call them the left family and the right family. Hey, so we'll say, so again, left family has two daughters, Machla and Noah, beautiful. Right family has three sons, Reuven, Shimon, and Levi. Reuven himself is married and has a son, Chanoch. Beautiful. 119.2, what happens? Chanoch married Machla. Now both say, now I know this is going to sound strange. No one's related to each other. There's no problems. This is just a good old-fashioned marriage, right? There's absolutely no problems over here, right? So Chanoch marries Machla. Okay. Unfortunately, Chanoch passes away. Fine. 119.3. Machla then goes and marries Shimon. And also, along the way, Noah, her sister, marries Levi. So at this point in time now, Shimon and Levi are married to two sisters. But remember, the wife of Shimon is also the former daughter-in-law of Reuven. That's what's happened over here. Okay, following this? Right? So again, like I said, straightforward case, very straightforward. So now at this point in time, again, Chanoch has passed away. Essentially, Chanoch's uncle Shimon married his widow, which again, no problem with that. There's no real halachic relation over there, right? So therefore, again, Machla is married to Shimon, and her sister, independently of this, marries Levi. What happens? 119.4, Shimon and Levi pass away. Shimon and Levi pass away. Now, I will say at this point in time, two distinct women fall before Ruvain, Shimon's widow and Levi's widow. Now, I will say Levi's widow, there's absolutely, it's fine. It's just a straightforward Yibum situation. There's no ever, there's no nothing. Shimon's widow, what's the problem? Shimon's widow, Machla, is also Ruvain's daughter-in-law. Or was Ruvain, in other words, was Ruvain's son's wife. Now, I will say the erva of a son's wife applies even if the son is no longer in the picture. So in this case over here, so Ruvain has two women falling before him in Yibum, Levi's widow, whom there's absolutely no problem, and Shimon's widow, who there is an erva situation. So I will say, so that's the case. Like I said, very straightforward. So if you look in the Mishnah says, Achosa shehi yevimta, choletzes omis yevemes. Now I will say, now in this case, could Shimon do Yibum with looking at line 119.4? Could Shimon do Yibum with Machla? Could he do Yibum with Machla? No, why not? It's his son's wife. I know it sounds strange, his son has passed away, but it's his son's wife. So he can't do Yibum with her. But I will say, but remember again, what did we learn in the Mishnah? Whenever you have an erva situation, the erva is essentially what? Removed from the Yibum context. Now what's interesting about this over here is as follows. Machla and Noah are sisters. So you might have thought that the fact that they're sisters therefore precludes Ruvain from doing Yibum with either one of them. Kamash Malan, that we view Machla as being essentially outside of the entire picture. Because since she is not shayeches to Yibum at all, she has nothing to do with Yibum, because Ruvain can't do Yibum with her, because she is an erva to him, we actually view her as if she's non-existent in this situation, which then allows Ruvain to do Yibum or Chalitza with Noah, whichever one he decides. Beautiful. We'll say that's that case. Again, we'll delve more into it in the Gemara, but that's the case. Excellent. But let's say, let's go back now. So remember again, the Mishnah said before, that you have cases of Isser Mitzvah and Isser Kedusha. And when a woman is either an Isser Mitzvah or Isser Kedusha, we tell the Yavam to do Chalitza and not do Yibam. What's Isser Mitzvah, Isser Kedusha? Isser Mitzvah, Shnios Midivrei Sofrim. So we'll say this, we're going to spend a lot of time on this in tomorrow's daf. This refers to what we call Shnios. So we'll say Shnios means women who are biblically permitted, but rabbinically prohibited. What we'll call a rabbinic erva. Those are called ultimately, again, Isser Mitzvah. Isser Kedusha. Who does Isser Kedusha refer to? That's Amar LeKohen Gadol, Grusha v'Chalutza LeKohen Hedyot, Mamzer u'Nesina LiYisrael, Ubas Yisrael u'Nesina LeMamzer. And we'll say, who's Isser Kedusha? Isser Kedusha is an example of, let's say, a Kohen Gadol marrying a widow, right? Or a regular Kohen marrying a divorcee. Or a Yisrael going ahead and marrying a Mamzeres, or a Nesina. We'll speak about the Nesinim, we've spoken about them before. The Nesinim, again, this goes back to the time of Yoshua ben Nun, where these individuals tricked Yoshua into thinking that they were a foreign people, when in fact they were one of the indigenous nations in Canaan. They converted, they were accepted, but their conversion was always subject to some level of dispute. Let's kind of frame this all together like this. So the Mishnah essentially is highlighting four different things. Principle number one. Whenever a woman is in erva to the yavam, what's the halacha? No yibum, no chalitza. In other words, there's nothing. She's simply ineligible for the process, and therefore by definition she's viewed outside of the framework. That then leads the Mishnah to the second case of what the Mishnah called achosa shehi yevimta. Two sisters who are married to two brothers, one of whom is an erva to the surviving brother. Essentially, again, we view her as out of the picture so that the surviving brother could do yibum with the eligible sister. That's part two. Part three, Rabbi Osai, was what? When it comes to an Isser Kedusha, or an Isser Mitzvah, or an Isser Kedusha. Isser Mitzvah is rabbinic erva. Isser Kedusha essentially is a marriage punishable by a lav, or subject to a lav. Now, both say we're going to see the interesting part with relationships that are prohibited by a lav is what? They work. In other words, when I say they work is, if you affect marriage with such a woman, the kiddushin is chal. It's aser, but it's chal. So what the Mishnah is saying is, when you have a yibum situation, where the woman is either an isser mitzvah, ultimately rabbinically prohibited to the yavam, or biblically prohibited, but not an isser kares, what we'll call just an isser lav. In those cases, we make the yavam do chalitza and tell him that he can't do yibum. Those are the rules of the Mishnah. Beautiful. Let's go back to it. Says the Mishnah, says the Gemara, klal asuyei bai. They're both say, in general, whenever a Mishnah espouses a rule, a principle, right, a klal usually comes to include something more than is stated in the Mishnah itself. So over here, the Gemara asks, what is it that the Mishnah is coming to include? Klal asuyei mai, amar Rafam bar Papa, la asuyei tsaras ailinus. Interesting to go ahead and include the co-wife of an islandess. Now, boss, and remember again, an islandess is a woman who is incapable of having children, but it's not just a woman who's barren. It's talking about a woman who fails to physically mature as a woman. So ultimately, again, this is not a simple fertility issue, right? This is lamaisa physiological issue as well. There's a lack of physical maturation. So the Mishnah says it's coming to include tsaras ailinus. Now, both say, remember, it's coming to include the fact that we saw this was the first Mishnah. The first Mishnah in the Masechta was that what? If you are the co-wife of an erva, you essentially what? Take on the same status as the erva herself. So when the Mishnah says klal, the Gemara suggests, Rafam bar Papa says it comes to include the co-wife of an islandess. Just like an islandess is not subject to yibum, her co-wife is exempted as well. Could Ravasi, in accordance with the opinion of Ravasi, take a look at Rashi, La sui tzaras islandess kid Ravasi, the parakamon dolo cholatzes velo misyavemes, the ervan karina ba'islandess, the miyata krame asher teled, the kaima la be'isr eshazach, hilchach tzaras erva, Taras erva. So Ravasi was the one who held that halacha l'maisa. This is very interesting. His position was that an islandess has the status of an erva, which is fascinating, right? Why? We'll say, what's the point of yibum? Lahakim zar la'achiv, to ultimately again establish offspring for the deceased brother. An islandess who is incapable of having children, Ravasi said, she's pretty much just like an erva. She's pretty much just like an erva, and therefore Allah Lamaisa again, her tzara, her co-wife, will become prohibited as well. And others say, well, it's an alternate version of this. Kol shisura is erva huda asira tzarasa. Ha lo isura isra erva tzarasa lo asira. So we'll say there's an alternate version. The other version is like this: anytime that the primary wife ultimately has an isra erva, so the co-wife is prohibited as well. But if the wife is not an isra erva, then her co-wife is not prohibited. For example, lemi'ute mai, amarafram lemi'ute tsaras ailinus, this would come to exclude the co-wife of an ailinus, udulo kravasi. So I will say, what it comes down to over here is just, so remember, all the Gemara is just trying to understand is when the Mishnah says klal, it's coming to include something that's not written here in the Mishnah. What is it coming to include? So we'll say, so here's what's fascinating. We saw this before in Yud Beis. There is a machlokes as to how to look at an islandess. Right? If a woman is incapable of having children because of a lack of physical maturation. And we'll say, when we say lack of physical maturation, it's not just the pshat that, she's late in maturing and she'll mature later on. This is the idea she's not going to physically advance. She's not going to physically mature in a feminine fashion. So therefore, I will say, here's what's interesting. How do you look at that woman? Is that woman viewed as an erva? Or is that woman viewed simply as someone who is ineligible for yibum? What's the nafkamina? Does she impact her tzara? If you view her as an erva, then ultimately again, an erva always disqualifies her tzara as well. If you just simply view her as ineligible, she's not an erva, she's just ineligible, then Allah says she's ineligible, but her co-wife ultimately is eligible. So we'll say that's the machlokes. Beautiful. Achos shivimta. Next case. So we'll say, remember again, we did this. This was the chart, right? The chart was helpful, no? Okay, no. All right, good. We'll say, so again, I thought it was helpful. Fine. So again, this was this case that we did achosa shivimta. So the Gemara says achosa deman. So we already did this in the Gemara. Whose sister are we referring to? Ilema de isser mitzvah. If you say it's a case of a woman who is the sister of an isser mitzvah, i.e. a rabbinic erva, keva de midaraisa ramya kamei. Paga ba'achos azikukaso. If Lamaisa, again, if it's only a rabbinic erva, then Lamaisa, that wife is still chayeves in yibum mid'oraisa, and to marry her sister would ultimately be marrying the sister of your zakuka. Alachosa de isser erva. Rather, you have to say it's talking about a case of a sister of an isser erva. A da'oraisa Rabbi Shmuel was exactly this case we went through on the sheet. Remember again, this is where Noah, right, because remember again, if you skip down all the way to 119.4, what we're looking at the end of the day is like this. Shimon and Levi both pass away. Their wives both fall before Ruvain. Now remember again, the issue over here is Machla is an erva to Ruvain. Why is she an erva to Ruvain? Because she is halachically, we'll call it, Ruvain's daughter-in-law. She's Ruvain's daughter-in-law. Noah is her sister. Noah is her sister. So I both say, but again, the chiddush of the Mishnah is that essentially we view Machla as what? As just out of the picture. We just don't view her as part of the equation because Lamaisa, again, she's not subject to Yibum. Because she's out of the picture, that allows Noah, who technically, now remember, look at this for just a moment. What is Noah? Noah is the sister of an erva da'oraisa, who's also subject to Yibum to the same man. But again, remember, this is not a case of Tzara. Why is it in a case of Tzara? Why not? They're married to two different men. Remember again, Sarah are co-wives, married to the same man. It's interesting, because in this case, the two sisters are falling to the same Yavam, Ruvain, right? And one of them is an erva, one of them is not. So again, our mind has been programmed in Yevamos to say, one second, two women fall to the same Yavam, one is an erva, one is not. So obviously, again, the erva disqualifies the other. No. The erva only disqualifies the other when the two women are connected. But in this case over here, there's not a marital bond between the two women, the two sisters. Therefore, the Maisa, we essentially view Machla as if she's out of the picture, right? Because she's out of the picture. She's totally ineligible for Yibum. She's just not subject to it. And that clears the way for Noah to ultimately do Yibum or Chalitza with Ruvain. Incredible. So now we're getting into really interesting sugyas. Isser mitzvos shniyos. So remember again, the Mishnah said, so just to be clear, if you have a woman who is an erva d'Rabbanan, now both say, we're going to get into these cases tomorrow. We're going to go through a whole chart in Mirat Hashem. We'll see a whole bunch of cases like this, rabbinic ervas, right? So these are women who are biblically permitted, but rabbinically prohibited. So what did the Mishnah say? If you have a yibum situation where the woman who falls to the yavam ultimately is what we call an Isser Mitzvah. And I will say Isser Mitzvah is Shnios. Shnios means literally a secondary class, which refers ultimately to rabbinic erva. So what happens in that kind of case, Rabbosai? What does the Yavam have to do according to the Mishnah? What does he have to do? Chalitza. Now remember again, you can't do nothing. Why can't you do nothing? Why can't you do nothing? Because remember again, midaraisa, this woman is eligible. But midrabanan, she's asura. So therefore what we make the yavam do is, you can't do yibum, we make him do chalitza. Again, we're going to illustrate these cases in tomorrow's daf. Says the Gemara, my karlu isser mitzvah. Why do we call a rabbinically prohibited woman, right? A woman who's an erva d'Rabbanan, why do we call her an isser mitzvah? So I'll say this is great. Amar Abaye, because mitzvah l'shma divrei chachamim. Yeah, it's very simple. Because there's a mitzvah to listen to Chazal. Right? When Chazal legislate laws, when Chazal legislate halacha, there's a mitzvah. Right? The Torah tells us we have an obligation to listen to the words, Lo sasa min hadavar sheyagidu lacha yaminu smol. Do not veer from what they, the Chazal, tell us right or left, because there's a mitzvah to go ahead and listen to Chazal, we call rabbinic law mitzvahs. Therefore, a woman who is rabbinically prohibited is going to be called an Isser mitzvah. Beautiful. Next, Isser Kedusha. So we'll say the next category, remember, was what? Isser Kedusha. Now we'll say, remember again, who are Isser Kedusha people? What are Isser Kedusha women? What are they? What are they? What type of prohibition? Doraisa. Biblically prohibited women, but they're the type of situations where what? Where if you were to marry them, the Kiddushin would be Chal. So it's the same type of scenario where essentially over here is to tell them to do nothing. Can't tell them to do nothing because technically they can affect Yibum with these women. But at the same time, Yibum would be a prohibition. So in this case, we tell the men, we tell the Yavam, you can't do Yibum, you have to do Chalitza. So for example, Isser Kedusha, Amar l'Kohen Gadol, Kedusha v'Chalutza l'Kohen Hedyot. Ultimately, again, this would be halacha l'maisa. 1 second, let me just see one thing. Okay, we'll do the Rambam. We'll do the Rambam in a bit. I want to jump ahead. Fine. Okay, we'll get to Rambam afterwards. Fine. So I'll say, this is Isser Kedusha, Amana l'Kohen Gadol, Grusha v'Chalutza l'Kohen Hedyot. So Isser Kedusha, the example of that would be an Amana to a Kohen Gadol, widow to a Kohen Gadol, or Grusha v'Chalutza to a Kohen Hedyot. So it says, Gemara, V'amai karilu Isser Kedusha. Why do we call these women an Isser Kedusha? Right? What does that mean? The Gemara says, Dichsiv, Kedoshim yiyu le'elokehem. Because the pasuk says, Sirbosei, it's interesting because although later on we get into Mamzer, but the first way the Mishnah illustrates this is by Kohanim. By Kohanim, there's a mitzvah of Kedoshim yiyu le'elokehem, right? That ultimately, again, an extra level of Kedusha. So therefore, again, it's called an Isser Kedusha because, again, these prohibitions, these women represent a prohibition to the Kahuna because of their obligation to maintain a heightened level of Kedusha. The Gemara says Rabbi Huda Machlef. Rabbi Huda actually switches around the categories. He says Isser Mitzvah is Amar l'Kohen Gadol, Grusha v'Chalutza l'Kohen Hedyot. So we'll say Rabbi Huda says like this. He holds the category of Isser Mitzvah actually refers to the Amana to the Kohen Gadol, Grusha and Chalutza to the Kohen Hedyot. V'amai karle Isser Mitzvah. Why do you call these women an Isser Mitzvah? Dichsiv Eila HaMitzvos. Ela mitzvos, because we'll say the pasuk when speaking about again the mitzvos, right, the prohibitions of the Kohanim to marry certain women, he used lashon of Ela hamitzvos, so he calls them Isser mitzvah, Isser kedusha shnios midivrei sofrim. So again, we'll say in Rabbi Huda's model, the Isser kedusha that refers to the women who are rabbinically prohibited as an erva. V'amai karile Isser mitzvah. V'amai karilu Isser kedusha. Why do you call rabbinically prohibited women Isser Kedusha? Rabbi said, this is beautiful. Amar Abaye, kol hamakayim divrei chachamim nikra kadosh. Rabbi said, because whoever upholds rabbinic law is called a kadosh. It's called a kadosh. Amar le Rava v'chol she'inu makayim divrei chachamim kadosh hu lo mikri rasha nami lo mikri. And tell me, and if you don't uphold rabbinic law, what, you're just not called the kadosh? Aren't you called the rasha? In other words, what does that mean? So you say, Amar Rava kadish atzmecha b'mutralach. Rather, Rava says that I will say, what does it mean to be kadosh? And I will say, it's quite beautiful. What does it mean to be kadosh? To be kadosh means to be able to sanctify yourself even with that which is permitted. The essence of kiddush, Rabbi say, is not just drawing the line between that which is mutter and that which is aser, but recognizing that sometimes you even have to draw the line in life within that which is permitted in order to go ahead and safeguard one's holiness. That sometimes what Kedusha means is not straddling the line between mutter and aser, but it means creating gidarim, creating boundaries. And boundaries sometimes means even prohibiting things that are inherently permitted, but we prohibit them in order to safeguard our spirituality. That's called Kedusha. That's called Kedusha. Now, both say the truth is these two answers are really linked, because that's what the Gemara says, that whoever upholds Divrei Chachamim is called Kadosh. Now, both say, what are Divrei Chachamim? What did Chazal do? Chazal rarely legislated new laws. Sometimes they did, but more often than not, what are Chazal doing? Chazal are creating protective fences around biblical law. So that's why the Gemara says whoever listens to Divrei Chachamim is called Kadosh, because the acceptance of rabbinic law essentially represents a willingness to prohibit that which is permitted for the greater good of safeguarding my spirituality. A person who is willing to give up certain things in order that are permitted, inherently permitted, to safeguard their ruchnius, such a person like that is called a kadosh. Rabbi say, what an incredible idea. Kiddusha, so what you see from this Gemara is what? Kiddusha doesn't come from just doing what you're expected to do. Right? Isn't this incredible? Right? Doing what I'm expected to do is what? Is what? It's the obligation, right? That's it. That's not Kiddusha. That's not Kiddusha. That's adherence. That's adherence. Kiddusha comes from going above and beyond. That Kiddusha comes when a person is willing to say, you know what, I know that this is okay. I know that it's technically permitted, but I also know that I have to draw my boundaries in life. So I'm willing to give up that which is permitted to me for the sake of the greater good of my ruchnius. That's called Kiddusha. What an incredible Yisrael. Rabbi says, I'll share with you two beautiful ideas. There's a fascinating idea here by the Vishnitzer Rebbe, the Avas Yisrael. He says, listen to this quote. He says, Etein lachem klal. He said, I'll give you a klal. He says, there are three categories in life. Masha aser, hare aser. There are things that are aser. What's aser is aser. And he says, mitzvah, those things that are a mitzvah, michuyavim lasos, you have to do. Here's the tricky part in life. So, right, what's aser is aser. What's a mitzvah is a mitzvah. What's the tricky part in life? Rak ma shemuter. What about the things in life that are mutter? The things in life that are mutter. Tzrichim heitiv lasos cheshbon, heim lasos olo. That's where you have to make a cheshbon, says the Vishnitzer Rebbe. Right? If it's aser, it's clear that I can't do it. If it's a mitzvah, it's clear that I have to do it. What if it's mutter? What if it's mutter? What if it's permitted? If something is permitted, says the Vishnitzer Rebbe, that's where a person really has to think, I know it's permitted, but should I do it? Should I do it or not? And to kind of build on that, I saw one more beautiful idea brought down in the Sefer Netzutzi Ashas. He brings down this idea. He gives an incredible mashal. I will say it's such a great mashal, and every parent could appreciate this mashal. He says that a father is traveling with his child, and the child goes out there, they're walking, and the child sees a store is selling ice cream, so the child wants ice cream. The father says, of course, buys the child an ice cream. They walk a little bit further, child sees a candy store, I want a chocolate bar. Father says, no, you can't have the chocolate bar, you just got the ice cream. So what does the child do? Well, right, as often children do. Right, first, of course, every child asks nicely, please, rations, reasons with the father. Child throws a fit. Mamish throws a fit. Father says, you know what, fine, here's the chocolate, but this is it. They pass a toy store. Right? I want that chashka, I want that thing. Father, look, come on. Got you the ice cream, got you the chocolate, that's it. Mamish, meltdown, mother of all meltdowns, right? And again, so father says, fine. You know what? Again, it's just give up. So he's quoting over here from the Sefer Mesilos Gad. So the Mechaber says, so the father buys the kid, right? The ice cream, the chocolate, the toy, giving everything. So at the end of the day, has the father done anything wrong by getting the child every single thing? So the truth is no, there's no isser, there's no this. But what's the problem with the chinuch that the child is getting? Bevadai margilim osala davar echad v'hu shemashu rotza chayiv lihios. See, the problem with this chinuch is the child has learned whatever you want, you get. Whatever you want, you get. And the Sefer Mesilos God says there is no more destructive hashkafa in life than thinking that just because you want it, you should have it. He goes on, he says, Vahergil zeh ramaot. This type of habituation of thinking that whatever you want, you get, is a terrible thing. Kevan shebehisraglo lekach, azai gam im yirtze bedavar isr chas v'shalom, lo yuchol lamod bazeh. See, Rabbi says, so much of life is recognizing you don't get whatever you want. You see, when you look at what happened with that father and child, is there anything wrong with, right? Look, the ice cream was Chalav Yisrael, right? The chocolate had, 50 hashkachas on it. The toy, it was a Dav Reb Chaim Kanievsky, whatever it was, right? It was mamish, every single thing, incredible. Except what kind of chinuch is that? What kind of chinuch is that? If a child grows up to think that they could have every single thing that they want, such a child who grows up getting every single thing they want will become an adult who wants who thinks he can get every single thing he wants. And I will say, that's not a Yid. That's not a Jew. Right? Kadesh is atzmucha b'mashe mutalach, nikra kodesh. Right? What does the Gemara say? Kadesh atzmucha b'mutalach. What's Kedusha? Kedusha is recognizing that just because you can have it does not mean you should have it. Like the Vishnitzer Rebbe said, sometimes even that which is mutter is not good for me. And I will say, by the way, it's an incredible yisod. It's an incredible yisod with parenting, because often we don't realize this. Like parents think that sometimes every parent loves their child, and every parent wants to give their child everything. But sometimes we don't realize that giving our children everything is not doing them a favor. It's being margil them in this mindset that if you want it, you could have it. And that's actually antithetical to a Jewish chinuch. Because the Jewish chinuch is, there are things that are aser and you can't do. There are things that are mitzvahs and you must do. And then there's that whole mutter category. But just because it's mutter doesn't mean you should do it. And just because it's mutter doesn't mean you should have it. Life is all about exercising proper restraint, right? And drawing our lines and avoiding a life of excess in all different ways. And the Gemara is telling us, halacha l'maisa, that's where Kedusha comes. Not just for chinuch, it's for ourselves also. Of trying to figure out in our own lives, in the realm of mutter, what is it that I should be having? And where is it that I should draw the line for myself? Because I recognize that if I don't draw my line here, I'm going to get into spiritual territory that is going to have a negative repercussion. Incredible. So let's go weiter. Says the Gemara. Amar Kohen Gadol. So remember again, the example of the Isser Kedusha, Isser Mitzvah that the Mishnah gave, Isser Kedusha, that the Mishnah gave was an almana to a Kohen Gadol. So here's what's interesting. Kapasik v'tani, lo shnami na nisur, lo shnami na erusin. Now here's what's interesting about this case. So we have an almana, so just to be clear, here's the situation. Imagine there's two brothers, Reuven and Shimon, right? They're both Kohanim. So now what happens? So now Reuven dies, Shimon also obviously the Kohen Gadol. So I'll say now you have an interesting situation, which is Shimon has an obligation of Yibum. Could Shimon do Yibum? No, why not? He's the Kohen Gadol. Kohen Gadol can't marry an almana. Right? Kohen Gadol can't marry a widow. So I will say, so now here's what's interesting about this. This is what the Mishnah called an Isser Kedusha. So we said that halacha l'maisa, the Kohen Gadol can't go, he has to do chalitza, can't do yibum. Then I both say, the Gemara makes a fascinating observation. Kapasek v'tani lo shnamina nisuv lo shnamina erusin. The truth is, the Mishnah makes no difference whether or not the widow was widowed from erusin or from nisuin. And I will say, now what's the nafkamina? Watch this is fascinating. I understand why, that if Reuven was fully married to his wife and then he passed away and he widowed her from Nisuin, I understand why Shimon, the surviving brother who's the Kohen Gadol, can't do Yibum. Do you know why? The Gemara says, Asay velo saseh, ve'ena asay docha lo saseh. Both say this is fascinating. Let's see what's going on over here. Remember again, on one hand we have an asay. What's the asay? Yibum. On the other hand, what do you have? If we're talking about a woman who was widowed from Nisuin, for a Kohen Gadol you have two issues. Number one, right, you have a lo saseh. What's the lo saseh? Kohen Gadol is not allowed to marry a widow. What's the asay? V'hu isha b'vsula yikach. The asay is Kohen Gadol must marry a besula. He has to marry a virgin. If she's widowed from Nisuin, I understand why he can't do Yibum, because although there's an asay of Yibum, there's a lo saseh that you can't marry a widow, and an asay that he has to marry a besula. And an asay cannot override a lo saseh, And then I say, look at Rashi just a moment. Kapasik Vitani. Rashi says over here, Amar Lokanod Loshna Nafla Lafana Min Asu and Dahanu Tarti Legriusa. Chad Da'amanahi, the Ikalav Da'amana, Lo Yikach, Va'od de Be'ulahi, the Ikar Isser Asay Dixit Isha Bivsulaha Yikach. So we'll say this is incredible. So I understand the case of where she's widowed from Nisuin, because you have an Asay of Yibum, but the Asay of Yibum cannot override the Asay and the Los Asay of number one, marrying a widow, and number two, marrying a woman who is not a Basula. Ela mina irusin Los Asay Gredehu, Yavo Asay V'yitcha Los Asay. Watch this. But I will say, what about where Ruvain died, but all he did with Rachel, his wife, was irusin. They never lived together. In which case now she's widowed. So you have the issue of a widow, but she's still what? She's still what? A basula. If that's the case, why don't we say that the asay of Yibum should be docha the lo asay that a Kohen Gadol can't marry an Amana? It's good kasha. Good kasha. Incredible. Rav Gidol Marav. Shabbos say, come Rav Gidol says the name of Rav. Listen to this. Amar Kra. The also Yivim to Ashara. The pasuk says that ultimately in Bosnia, this is actually the pasuk by Chalitza. So the pasuk says, "Im lo yachpolsa ish lakachas es yevimto." If the man does not want to marry his yevama, va'alsa yevimto hashara. Ultimately, again, the yevama will go up to the gate. Now, we'll say shara is a reference to the Beis Din. So now, look what Rav says. Shein tamalomer yevimto. The truth is, the pasuk doesn't need to say yevimto. It's unnecessary, because you know who we're talking about. Ma tamaloma yevimto. So why does it say yevimto? So look at this drasha. Yesh lecha yevama achash ola lechalitza ve'eno ola liyibum. Rav says it's coming to teach us that there is a type of yevama who can only do chalitza and can never do yibum. Who is that yevama who can only do chalitza and never do yibum? So ve'ezo zu chayve lavin. Rav says, I will say, what the Gemara is coming to teach us, the Mishnah is coming to teach us, is that halacha l'maisa, whenever you have a situation where the yevama is prohibited to the yavam by penalty of a lav, not an iser kares, a lav. What's the halacha? She is only subject to chalitza and cannot do yibum. In other words, even though you're making a cogent halachic argument, which is let the asay of yibum be doche, the lo asay of amana, Rav darshans va'osa yevimto ashara. The Torah didn't need to say yevimto, the yevama. The fact that it mentions yevama is coming to speak about someone specific. There is a yevama, there is a person who is only subject to chalitza and is not permitted to do yibum. Who is the woman who could only do chalitza and cannot do yibum? That is the woman who is prohibited through a lav. That's the example of Rabbi Saib. What? For example, an almana to a Kohen Gadol, even if she was widowed when? From Erison. It's beautiful. I mean, it's not beautiful, it's tragic, but I'm saying, but you understand, halachically it's beautiful. Halachically it's beautiful. So the Gemara says, maybe it's talking about a woman who's subject to kares. In other words, how do you know it's a woman subject to a lav? Maybe this is true even by relationships punishable by kares, and telling you, going back to the first parak, telling you that even if a woman is an Isser Erva, maybe the Yavam still has to do chalitza. Amakra im lo yachpotza ish lakachas hachafetz miyabim, because the way the pasuk reads about say is that Allah chalamayisa, we're talking about a man who technically could do yibum, but instead of doing yibum, he's doing chalitza. Kol ola liyibum ola lechalitza, v'chol she'ein ola liyibum eina ola lechalitza, to teach us about saying that chalitza is only an option when you, so we had this at the beginning of the Masechta. Yibum and Chalitza are the two sides of the same coin. Chalitza is only possible and Yibum is only possible, and Yibum is only possible and Chalitza is only possible. But one second, if that's the case, I don't understand. Then how can you do Chalitza in this case as well? Both say, again, is a Kohen Gadol allowed to do Yibum with the widow, even if she was widowed from? Is a Kohen Gadol allowed to do Yibum with a widow? Is he allowed to? No. So he can't do Yibum. If that's the case, he can't do Yibum. How can he do Chalitza? So the Gemara says, Rachmana Yevimto. That's the pasuk comes to say Yevimto. Yevimto is talking about a specific case where halacha lamaisa, even though Yibum is not allowed, Chalitza will be mandated. Umarois, but I understand. So why are you coming to include the case of Almana? Why don't you instead say that it refers to Chayve Kares? Alabes Mistabra, Chayve Lavin Taf Sibahu Kiddushin, Chayve Krisos Lo Taf Sibahu Kiddushin. So I'll say, it's very simple. It's very simple. But I'll say essentially what Rav's drasha is like this, is that Halacha L'maisa, Yevimto is coming to teach us the following case. There are cases where technically speaking, Yibum, Yibum is aser, but if you were to do it, what? It would work. It would work. It would work. Those are cases where we tell the Yavam, Yibum is aser, and you must do chalitza. Which case we're both saying? Chayve lavin. It's actually a very, very, very important principle. So what the Mishnah is saying is, any time you have a Yibum scenario where halacha l'maisa, the marriage is aser al tzalav, Yibum is technically possible. Aser, but possible. Therefore, again, in those cases, you must do chalitza. So therefore, I both say in the case, so let's go back for just a second. So here's what's fascinating. This is why, remember again, how do we get into this conversation? What we're trying to figure out is, the Mishnah gave a case of Almana l'Kohen Gadol. Almana l'Kohen Gadol. Right? So remember again, we were trying to ask, so why can't, I understand if the woman was widowed from Nisuin, I understand why the Kohen Gadol can't do Yibum. Why? Because although there's an Asay of Yibum, on the other end of the equation, what do you have? You have a Los Asay of Amara and an Asay of Besula. Right? So the Asay of Yibum can't override the Los Asay and the Asay of this woman. Fine. But if she was widowed from Erisin, all I have is what? Is a Los Asay. So I have an Asay of Yibum, a Los Asay of Amana. Let the Asay of Yibum override the Lo Asay of Amana. Rav comes along and says, the drasha says, Va'alsa Yevimto, to teach you that halacha l'maisa, whenever there is a love on this woman, on this marriage, we mandate chalitza and we don't allow Yibum. I will say, by the way, the novelty in this is, remember, Yibum always allows a prohibition. Which prohibition? Eshes Ach, right, your brother's wife. But apparently what what we're learning over here, and we've already seen this, is Yibum really only has the power to allow that one prohibition of Eshes Ach. Once you have additional layers of prohibition upon you, ultimately, again, Yibum will be Aser. The Chiddush over here is, even though Yibum is Aser, you're going to have to do Chalitza. Incredible. So let's go weiter. Says the Gemara, massive Rava. So Rava raises a kasha, Isser mitzvah, Isser kiddusha. If you have a woman who's in Isser mitzvah, but remember again, Isser mitzvah we said are women who are rabbinic arayos. Isser kiddusha is like Amar l'Kohen Gadol, Grusha to Kohen Hedyot. Ba'aleha, we'll say, let's say again, the Yavam had relations with her. They had relations, so he did Yibum. Ba'aleha, o chalatz, or for that matter, again, they did chalitza, right? Niftirat sarasa. Ultimately, if there are co-wives, the co-wives are exempted as well. Says here, 1 second. Vi sakadaita chayve lavin mida'araisa lechalitza ramya libum laramya ki ba'aleha amay niftirat sarasa. I don't understand. But if you're correct, that any time that there's a lav, right? Any time that there is a lav, a daraisa lav, ultimately, again, such a woman is not subject to Yibum, only subject to Chalitza. If the man illegally had relations with her, then why does that exempt the co-wife? Such an act should be looked at as just a regular illicit act, not as an act of Yibum, and the tzara, the co-wife, should still be eligible for Yibum. Humosiv lava humafarik law. Ultimately, Rava raised the question, and Rava answered the question. Let's studin katani. I will say, ultimately, again, you have to read those two phrases separately. Ba'aleha isser mitzvah. No, I will say, the case of where the Yavam had relations with her, that's the case of shnios, where the woman is only aser midrabanan. Okay, so now this makes more sense. If you have a woman who is an isser evra midrabanan, so they're not supposed to do yibum, they're supposed to do chalitza. What if they did yibum? What if they did yibum? It works. It's Yibum. Now again, the ability to sustain that marriage afterwards is a separate discussion. But Lamaisa, if you have a woman who is rabbinically prohibited to the Yavam, they're not supposed to do Yibum, but if they did, the Yibum works. Chalatzla Isser Kedusha. The second part, when it said if he did chalitza with her, that's referring ultimately again to the Isser Kedusha, to the woman ultimately again who is or prohibited by a lav. Good. Massive Rava raises a kasha. Pitzua daka krushivcha. So we'll say these are interesting sugyas, which we're going to actually spend a lot of time on this. This is coming down the pike, right? So, thank you. All right, so we'll say, so again, so, come on. All right, so Pitzua Daka, the Pitzua Daka will say, so again, these are individuals, these are men who are not permitted to marry into the general population. We'll discuss why that is. Pitzua Daka literally means crushed testicles. Krus Shavcha refers, it's interesting, Krus Shavcha often is translated as a severed organ, but we're going to see it doesn't mean severed. What it means is it's a physical blemish that doesn't allow the zera, that doesn't allow the semen to come out of the body with force, but instead it comes out as a trickle. So these are, again, we'll discuss these halachas. So P'tzua Daka, Krushav Nabosai, bottom line for our purposes is these men are not permitted to marry what we'll call regular women, regular Jewish women. So the Gemara says, Sris Adam Nabosai is a person. Rashi says, Shesirsu Adam v'lo machmas choli nistaris. This is a person who has become sterile as a result of some type of event that occurred, not by the hands of heaven, so to speak, right? Not by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, not a natural state, but rather, again, something that happened to him. V'hazokein. We'll say Zokein. What's the case of Zokein? Zokein is just a guy who's old. We'll say, what's common denominator amongst all these people? Common denominator? They can't have children. They can't have children. So in all of these cases, O choltzin, O miyavmin. So we'll say in these cases, what does the Gemara say? They could either do chalitza or yibum, right? So the Gemara says. So we'll say now we're going to see the gra actually changes this to garas choltzin velo miyavmin. And the way it's supposed to read is these people do chalitza and they don't do yibum. Ketzad. Okay, let's see the case. Now Rashi says over here, no, that's not Rashi's girsa. Rashi says over here, Omi Yabmin, Lav Lechatchila Kamar, Ella, Yibuman Yibum, Shimbalu Kana Kidiktani Va'azil. So Rashi says, what it means about says, obviously not Lechatchila they can't do Yibum, but rather again, if they did have relations with the Yevamo, technically speaking, it affects Yibum. So okay, so Rabbi say, what's the case? Here we go. Mesum, V'lahem Achim, V'lahem Nashim. So we'll say, here's case number one. So imagine again, we have brothers, right? Brothers. Brother 1, Pitzua Daka, brother 2, Kroshivcha, brother 3, Ksurs Adam, brother 4, Zaken. It's quite a mishpacha. Right, so we'll say, so again, you don't need all of these guys, but what it means is you have some of these guys. Right, so we'll say, what happens? Any of these individuals, they die. And obviously, again, they don't have children. Meisu v'lahem achim, v'lahem nashim. So these guys died, they left behind wives and surviving brothers. V'amdu achin v'asu ma'amar b'nishoseihan. And ultimately, the surviving brothers came along and did ma'amar with the wives. V'nasnu get, and they gave a get. V'chaltsu, and they did chalitza. Masha asu. What they did is done. V'im ba'alu kanu. But if they had bia, right, if there was relations, ultimately, again, they acquired the wives. Fine. But so here's what we want to focus on. Meisu achim. Shabbos say, let's say you have, so let's just say you have this case. Ruvain, Shimon, and Levi. Ruvain, Shimon, and Levi. Ruvain is a Pitzua Daka. Ruvain's a Pitzua Daka. Now what happens?